Hello, and welcome to These Aren't the SCs You're Looking For, Misadventures in WCAG 2 Interpretation and Audits. My name is Patrick Lauke. I work as a Principal Accessibility Specialist at Tetralogical. Previously, I've been with the Paciello Group, now TPGI. I'm an occasional W3C Accessibility Guidelines Working Group member, and I'm a self-confessed WCAG trash panda. Now, I've been working in the field of accessibility for what feels like eons. I've been doing accessibility audits, advising and reviewing the work of other engineers doing audits, being active on accessibility mailing lists such as WebAIM, W3C's mailing lists, Twitter, Slack, and far too often, and what really grinds my gears, is I see the same question always bubble up. Which success criterion can I fail this under? And to me, that belies a certain attitude and a certain problem with the way some people do audits. Here's a graphic of a little cartoon character. Fail all the things. And far too often, I seem to find that attitude with auditors. Far too often, auditors clearly dislike something and look for a justification to fail it. And in doing so, sometimes, not always, but sometimes, they overstep the boundaries of WCAG's own success criteria. They claim that something has to be changed to pass WCAG, when it really normatively doesn't actually fail it. And here we have an animated GIF of Sylvester Stallone in 1995's Judge Dredd. I am the law. And that seems to be the attitude that some of the auditors take. Now, we're not lawyers or judges, but our audits and evaluations often have some legal dimension to them. Evaluations should be as objective as possible. Evaluations should be consistent because they might entail a lawsuit, for instance. Of course, this is easier said than done. Now, WCAG is built on the idea that success criteria can be evaluated clearly, unambiguously, and consistently. But unfortunately, the reality is that that's not always the case. And through this presentation, I'll show you a few cherry-picked examples. Of course, I could go on for hours and hours, but nobody's got the time for that. So, WCAG success criteria are often misunderstood or misinterpreted when doing an audit. This can lead to the wrong or at least inconsistent error reporting. And here we have an animated GIF of Obi-Wan waving his hand. These aren't the droids you're looking for, which is the conceit of the title of this talk. Often, these aren't the success criteria you're looking for. So let's take a few examples, and don't worry, I will not go through every single WCAG success criterion, near enough. So 246, headings and labels. Headings and labels describe topic or purpose. Now, this criterion doesn't mandate the use of headings and labels at all. Only that if a page does use headings and labels, they must be descriptive. It also doesn't mandate that headings and labels need to be properly marked up with a H1, H2 or a proper label element. That's the job of 131 info and relationships, and where it affects the accessible name of controls, for instance, 412 name role value. And lastly, if the labels aren't there at all, if you have a form without any labels, that's a 332 labels or instructions problem, not a 246 headings and labels problem. Now, 332 labels or instructions. Labels or instructions are provided when content requires user input. Again, this SC doesn't mandate that labels need to be marked up as label elements and properly associated with their relevant form controls. Once again, that's covered by 131 info and relationships. And again, where it affects the accessible name of controls, 412 name role value. So let's bring out a few markup examples. Here we have a very simple paragraph. It has a class of heading 1. So clearly we're doing some styling here. And it says more information. Now this piece of markup passes 246 headings and labels, assuming that that is actually a descriptive label, a descriptive heading for what follows this particular piece of text. So it acts as a heading. It probably is visually styled as a heading, and it is descriptive. So it passes 246. However, this will fail 131 info and relationships, because while visually something here is styled, big, bold as a heading, the markup does not reflect that. So 131 kicks in. Another example. Here we have an absolutely basic text input. Input type text. No text near it that might give it a particular label. No accessible name, nothing. Now this, once again, passes 246 headings and labels, because that success criterion only applies if headings and labels are present. They must be descriptive. In this case, there's no label, so there's no problem under that success criterion. However, it will fail 332 labels or instructions, which does say when I'm expecting user input, there needs to be a label or an instruction. And it will also fail 412 name role value, because that input is lacking an accessible name altogether. Now let's stick some text before this input. Here I've just added a paragraph, first name, just before the input element itself. Now this passes 246 headings and labels. There is a label there now, and it seems to be descriptive, assuming that that input actually expects first name. It also passes 332 labels or instructions now, because once again, there is a label there. However, it will fail at this stage 131 info and relationships, because there is no connection between that piece of text and the actual input itself. It will also fail label and name, because first name arguably is the visual label for that control, but its accessible name, which is completely absent, does not contain that text. And it will also fail 412 name role value, once again because it's missing an actual accessible name. Now if we stick an ARIA label onto that input that reflects the same text, first name, this once again passes 246 headings and labels. It passes 332 labels or instructions. It now passes 253 label and name, because the accessible name given by the ARIA label contains the same visual label text that we see above it. It also now passes 412 because the input actually has an accessible name, and arguably it passes 131 info and relationships. Yes, we didn't mark up first name as an actual label and associated with the input, but the end result is the same. There is an association with the text first name. It's just injected directly via ARIA label in this case. Another example, 211 keyboard. All functionality of the content is operable through a keyboard interface. Fairly straightforward. However, the success criterion doesn't say anything about which keyboard keys are needed to operate, say, a control or a functionality. And that seems to trip up some auditors every now and again. Here's a very basic example. We have a link. It has been given a row of buttons, so it acts effectively as a button. And for brevity's sake, it has an inline on-click handler that, for instance, opens a dialog, whatever. Some functionality happens on click on this link. Now, links can only be activated by default with enter. Buttons, on the other hand, can be fired with enter or space. But in this case, this particular construct passes 211 because there is a way using a keyboard to trigger this functionality. Yes, it doesn't trigger it via space, even though it says it's a roll of button, but that's irrelevant within the context of 211 keyboard. A more extreme example, not that I've ever encountered this in real life, is a link, again, given a roll of button, and it has link text activate using B. And then in my JavaScript, I've added an event listener that listens to key press. And for some bizarre reason, the author decided once the B key is pressed, only then actually trigger something. Now again, this is a very bizarre construct, but it passes 211 because unarguably there is a way to use a keyboard interface to operate this particular control, even though it doesn't fire on space or enter or anything normal, but only when you press the B key. And again, we have to pass this because that's what 211 demands. That's all. Further success criteria that often confuse auditors: 323, consistent navigation. Navigational mechanisms that are repeated on multiple web pages within a set of web pages occur in the same relative order each time they are repeated, unless a change is initiated by the user. Now, normatively, this only requires that the relative order of the navigation in relation to other page components has to be the same. If you have navigation at the start of your document, then it must always come at the start of the document and not mix and match. Sometimes it's here, sometimes there's the main content first, etc. That's all this particular success criteria mandates. It doesn't say that navigation must be the same across all these pages. If I add extra navigation buttons, or if it uses even a completely separate structure of navigation, that's irrelevant within the context of 323, which only wants you to make sure that it's in the same relative order. 133, sensory characteristics. Instructions provided for understanding and operating content do not rely solely on sensory characteristics of components, such as shape, color, size, visual location, orientation, or sound. Now, this only relates specifically to instructions. And it doesn't actually say anything about whether or not sensory characteristics are used in your content. This is covered by other SCs like 141 use of color, or even 111 non-text content. And to clarify this, I've recently made a little fix, or submitted a fix to the understanding document, purely because I came across many instances of auditors dinging content under this when it wasn't actually relevant. A recent one that I've come across is SCs that are being interpreted effectively as their opposite. And a classic example that for some reason I've seen twice in the last few weeks is 141, use of color. Color is not used as the only visual means of conveying information, indicating an action, prompting a response, or distinguishing a visual element. Now, as an example, I have two lines of text here. They both contain a link. The links are not underlined. In the first line, the link has a different color to the static text. In the second line, the link is there, but it's effectively invisible. It uses exactly the same text color, as the static text itself. Now, the first case where we have black text and the blue link, text link, that would fail 141 use of color, because in this case, clearly the author is using color to identify that there is a link there. In the second case, where the link is effectively indistinguishable from the static text, there is no use of color. So we can't fail that under use of color because no color is used. And I've had lengthy discussions, very metaphysical at some points, discussions about, yes, but they are using color, but they're using the same color as the text. But effectively, you cannot claim, in my mind, that the second line with the link looking exactly like the static text is a failure of 141. Yes, it's rubbish, and we're all agreed on that, but you can't argue that it's a failure of 141. And then sometimes when we find errors in pages, they're not just isolated small things, and they lead to what I like to call cascades of fail. To give you an example of a cascade of fail, I have a very simple link, and the link is wrapped around an image. Now the image itself doesn't have any alt text, there's no further text inside the link. Now this fails multiple success criteria. In sequence, the image itself fails 111, non-text content. Now as a result, because there is no actual text content, the link itself lacks an accessible name and fails 412 name role value. And arguably, you could say that the link also fails 244, link purpose in context, again, because there is actually no link text. Now this is nothing new, but problems can occur when you encounter something like this. How do you report this? I've come across situations where an auditor would just pick one of these, pick the most important success criterion that this content violates, and just file an issue under that and say, okay, this is a 111 failure and nothing else. Other cases, and I lean more towards those, are failing in your report all the different success criteria that this construct violates. It's tedious and can lead to consistency problems if you're working with other auditors that take a different approach. But that is certainly something that if you're working, say, in a team, in an organization, you have to decide on. How do we report these things? And all of these are undoubtedly problems that can be solved with auditor education and with establishing some kind of standards of consistency. Like I just mentioned, how do we report cascades of fail? Do we just pick one, or do we fail each and every SC that this particular construct violates? Now, more problematic are issues caused by WCAG itself. Some WCAG SCs are vague or incomplete or even lacking. Now, WCAG 2 isn't perfect. I'm not here to diss WCAG. It's written by well-meaning but fallible humans. Often success criteria don't consider all possible edge cases and scenarios of how they can be applied to real-world content, because real-world content is messy and there's so many variations, they can't all be foreseen. To start with the simple cases, a lot of the WCAG success criteria are slightly subjective, and they require subjective interpretation. Even from the most basic ones, 111, images, non-text content, if I can remember my own success criteria. All non-text content has a text alternative that serves the equivalent purpose. But what's the purpose? Who is to say? That requires some subjective interpretation. And even years after WCAG 2.0 came out, we are still sometimes debating this. You get 2 or 3 accessibility experts and they'll give you 5 different opinions. 131. Information structure and relationships conveyed through presentation. But where do you draw the line? There are certain situations, and I'll give a small example in a second, where arguably something is presented visually. Does it fail if it doesn't have a particular matching structure behind it? There is a certain leeway. And we've already seen the issues with 246. Headings and labels describe topic or purpose. But what's descriptive enough to pass 246? Again, that requires some human judgment, some interpretation. As an example of 131 and the subjectivity there, here we have a div element. It's been given a class of footer, probably has some styling related to making it look like a footer right at the bottom of the screen, possibly looking different from the main content of the page. Do you fail this under 131, info and relationships, because they don't use the actual footer element? Or because there's no role content info? Who's to say? The footer may be styled differently from the rest of the page, but is its purpose not clear from the context? It will depend. It's arguable, but it's not a clear-cut case where you can say this just fails 131. Similarly, lengthy discussions over years. Here we have a very basic navigation element. It has 3 links: home, products, contact. They're presented on a single line and just separated with slashes. Now in the markup, all we have is 3 links and no further structure around it to hold them. Now, do you fail this under 131, info and relationships? Because these weren't wrapped in a UL, unordered list element? Some people will argue, or some auditors will argue, that yes, because intrinsically this is clearly a list and you haven't marked this up as a list, so you're failing 131. But 131 only says things that are visually apparent must match in terms of markup. And here, visually, this does not look like a list, arguably. So it's nothing there conveyed through presentation that we need to convey in the markup as well. Again, subjective interpretation. WCAG itself also has a few strange omissions, arguably. We have 244 link purpose in context. The purpose of each link can be determined from the link text alone, or from the link text together with its programmatically determined link context. Great, but what about buttons or similar controls? Well, they're not covered by this success criterion because it's scoped specifically to links. Well, you could think, well, perhaps this aspect, if I have buttons that are ambiguous, maybe that's covered by 412, name role value. Arguable. 412, name role value. For all user interface components, the name and role can be programmatically determined. It doesn't say anything about the name being unambiguous. Buttons need to have a programmatically exposed accessible name, yes, but it doesn't mandate anything about that name making sense or really conveying the purpose of that particular control. Now, some auditors will argue that's implicit. Others go by the letter of the success criteria and say it doesn't state anything about descriptiveness or appropriateness of that accessible name. And here's 2 examples. We have a paragraph, my amazing article, a following paragraph with a link, read more. Now this would fail 244 link purpose because read more has no context that explains what that link actually does, what the purpose of that link is. However, if instead of a link we had a button, my amazing product, and in the next paragraph, add to cart button, arguably that's fine. Under 412, name, role, value, that passes. You could argue that it also doesn't fail any other criterion. unless you want to drag out 246 headings and labels and start making an argument about how descriptive the label of that particular button is. Or maybe you want to drag out 131 info and relationships because you argue that my amazing product and whatever the heading for that product may be earlier on in the page needs to have some kind of programmatic association with that button. But again, it's not necessarily clear cut. And often what you get at that point in the discussion is somebody saying, well, I think what the founding fathers or mothers of WCAG meant to say. And here I have an animated GIF of the dude even, in The Big Lebowski, shaking his head. That's just your opinion, man. Now, in order to make the intent of success criteria and what they actually try to achieve slightly clearer, WCAG not only contains the normative success criteria, but it also provides understanding documents and techniques to try and clarify. Now, understanding documents and techniques are what's called non-normative, so they don't necessarily add any new requirements, but they try to explain what the intent of the normative success criteria actually are. The problem with that is that understanding documents and techniques can't provide examples of all possible scenarios. And as we already said, real-world content out in the wild is far more complex than anything that could be exhaustively documented. So they only give certain examples. And often I find auditors trying desperately to find a particular technique that exactly matches what they're currently evaluating and not finding anything. And then taking an assumption of, well, that must fail in that case, since no example of this particular construct that I'm currently looking at was provided. But that's not the case. Also, we find situations where a particular technique uses very specific markup or a very specific approach, and some developers and auditors mistake that to mean that is the only true, the one true way of implementing this sort of thing. And again, that is not the case. Techniques or even examples in the understanding document are not exhaustive. They are purely examples of here is one way of achieving a pass in this success criterion. There might be many more, but they're not documented. Now, beyond the need for subjective interpretation, there are certain loopholes in WCAG success criteria. 247, focus visible. Any keyboard operable user interface has a mode of operation where the keyboard focus indicator is visible. But what does visible mean? It's not actually defined normatively anywhere in WCAG. So once again, we have some vague language, some slightly subjective interpretation. And to take an extreme example, we have two buttons here on the screen, both say sign in. They look virtually identical, but the one on the right is focused. And if we zoom in, I have a little zoomed in version of that button, we see that the focus indication in this case is a single, very light grey extra pixel that's been added. Now, arguably, it's a very strenuous argument, but arguably, this is visible. And therefore, this would, in a very literal and strict interpretation of the success criterion, pass. It's completely useless, but it passes. Now, this was a flaw in WCAG 2.0. When WCAG 2.1 was being worked on. A decision was made to make sure that it's backwards compatible, that such problems, such loopholes, wouldn't be addressed directly in success criteria. So focus visible wasn't shored up to make it stricter. But instead, new success criteria were added to try and patch these loopholes. However, adding extra success criteria might sometimes lead to more loopholes. In this case, the idea was that 1-4-11 non-text contrast would help patch some of these focus visibility issues. 1-4-11 reads, the visual presentation of the following have a contrast ratio of at least 3:1 against adjacent colors. User interface components. Visual information required to identify user interface components and states. And then it has much more information about graphical objects, etc. But the idea here is that this criterion mandates that states, such as focus state, need to have sufficient contrast. Okay, here we have the same two sign-in buttons. The one on the right is focused again, and we've zoomed in, and we see that we still only have a single pixel that has changed. The focus state is still only conveyed by that one single pixel, but this time we made sure that that pixel has a 3:1 contrast ratio. Of course, this is completely spurious, but to the letter of the success criteria, this now passes both focus visible and 1-4-11 non-text contrast. Now, 1-4-11 non-text contrast also talks about the visual presentation of the following have a contrast ratio of at least 3:1 against adjacent colors. Note that this only applies normatively to adjacent colors. It doesn't apply to contrast between different colors used for states of the same control, because they will not be adjacent. If a control, for instance, receives focus and changes color, that color, the new color, is not adjacent to the old color, arguably. They are completely replacing each other, so you cannot compare the two. Now here's an example where 1-4-11 would help. We have 3 buttons in a pill-like kind of interface. 1, 2, and 3. 1 and 3 are grey. 2, which is the one that is currently focused, has a very, very light greenish kind of color instead of the grey. Now, these buttons are all bunched together, and between the grey and that very light green color, the contrast is very low. So this fails 1-4-11, non-text contrast. However, to work around this, all I need to do is add an extra border between these buttons. Now, the light green color and the grey color are not adjacent anymore. There is a darker line in between them. So this now passes 1-4-11 non-text contrast. So in these situations, we still have cases where, yes, it's completely rubbish. You can't actually see which element has focus, or you can't comfortably see it, but it doesn't really fail neither focus visible nor non-text contrast. And obviously the situation is even clearer when you're completely replacing, as I mentioned before, you're completely replacing the color between focused and unfocused on the same control. There are no other controls next to it that you could claim are adjacent. One saving grace might be 1-4-1 use of color in this case. 1-4-1 use of color. Color is not used as the only visual means of conveying information indicating an action, prompting a response, or distinguishing a visual element. Sounds great. However, there's an escape clause in the non-normative F73 failure technique that tries to redefine by the backdoor what color means. So F73, failure of success criterion 141 due to creating links that are not visually evident without color vision. So disregarding the actual topic of this technique, the salient point here is it gives an example, the technique gives an example of a line of red text, and in that line there is a link that is only identified through the use of pink color. No underline, nothing else. Now you'd think, okay, that fails clearly use of color because I'm using just color to show this is a link compared to the text. However, because this interpretation would have failed so much content on the web if it had been interpreted in this very strict way, a slight escape clause was built into this technique, saying, note, red and pink are the same color, brackets hue, but they have different lightness, which is not color. So red and pink would pass the requirement for not distinguished by color, brackets hue alone, since they differ by lightness, which is not color, as long as the difference in lightness, brackets contrast, is 3:1 or greater. So what we had until recently is a note buried in a non-normative technique down a flight of stairs in a locked cabinet, redefining what color actually means. Now, since then, I've actually made yet another pull request. I've now at least made it clear in the understanding document itself. So I've extracted this note from the technique where it was buried, moved it to the understanding document. So in WCAG 2.2, when it's released, the understanding document for 141 will more explicitly and clearly state this fact that we're making a differentiation between color and lightness and contrast. But you come away with the feeling that, yes, we have some rules. Some rules can be bent, others can be broken. And I have an animated GIF here of Morpheus in the Matrix, in the Kung Fu simulation, doing the come at me kind of sign. So all of these problems relating to focus are known. They were known when 2.0 was out, which is why we had 1.4.11 to try and patch it. And the shortcomings that led to are also known. But we'll fix that in WCAG 2.2. Question mark. There are two new success criteria being developed for WCAG 2.2. 2.4.11, focus appearance minimum at AA. And 2.4.12, focus appearance enhanced at AAA. So hopefully, third time lucky, we'll now have 3 separate sets of success criteria from 2.0, 2.1 and now in 2.2, which will effectively all try desperately to deal with situations of making sure focus is clear enough. A further problem with some WCAG success criteria is that in some cases they are overly specific. They only apply to a very specific situation in the way that they are written. And they only apply in very specific circumstances as a result of that. 1.4.10, reflow. Content can be presented without loss of information or functionality and without requiring scrolling in 2 dimensions. 4. Vertical scrolling content at a width equivalent to 320 CSS pixels. Horizontal scrolling content at a height equivalent to 256 CSS pixels. Now this success criterion, it goes on for much longer, but this success criterion is meant to help low vision users that require up to 400% zoom to make sure that things reflow, that the user doesn't have to scroll in two directions in order to just read, say, a line of text. But in the way that this was normatively specified, it now only applies to those exact values at a width equivalent to 320 CSS pixels, at a height equivalent to 256 CSS pixels. Any other pixel value, 321, if my viewport is 330 CSS pixels, it doesn't apply anymore. Only at that particular very specific width or height can I evaluate content against and pass or fail it. Now, again, you could game this, arguably. I've made an example that is artificial, sure, but you could create content that, for instance, has two-dimensional scrolling at every other resolution, at every other viewport size, but then inject a very specific media query that specifically says when the width is exactly 320 CSS pixels, and then you fix it just for that particular case. This would then pass the success criterion, regardless of the fact that at any other viewport size, it would drastically fail. But the success criterion only requires it at that size. Very similar situation, 1.4.12 text spacing. In content implemented using markup languages that support the following text style properties, no loss of content or functionality occurs by setting all of the following and by changing no other style property. Line height, line spacing to at least 1.5 times the font size, spacing following paragraphs to at least 2 times the font size, letter spacing, tracking, to at least 0.12 times the font size, word spacing to at least 0.16 times the font size, and it goes on. Now again, there are very specific values being mentioned in the normative text, and only those exact values and over can be taken into consideration when evaluating this. If content breaks or stops working at a line height of 1.4 instead of 1.5, that's not a failure. And again, arguably a bit artificial, but I've made an example that uses JavaScript to detect if the line height is set exactly to 1.5 or higher, apply a certain fix that makes sure that your content doesn't overlap or require scrolling or anything becomes cut off. At any other text metric, if I set my line spacing to 1.4 instead of 1.5, this will break. But normatively, this passes because the success criterion very explicitly says, in this case, line height of 1.5 or higher. Now, even after years of auditing, I have these weird moments of realization, seeing success criteria. And once you start really digging into it, which is where my WCAG Trash Panda passion comes in, you start to see gaps and flaws and limitations of the way this is normatively defined. It only applies in this situation. I thought it would apply to this other thing, and it doesn't. And here we have a picture, a meme picture of Sudden Clarity Clarence, a guy standing in the middle of a very crowded party, looking shocked and confused. WCAG might be wrong, or I might be wrong. Now, these same discussions about when does this success criterion apply, is there a loophole here, are we creating certain problems, is this too vague or subjective? All of these discussions happen both on mailing lists and Slack and everywhere else, but they even happen within the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group itself, which can be a bit scary for people trying to learn accessibility, seeing that even the experts, so to speak, that are devising these guidelines sometimes, or very often, can't actually agree on things. And all of this stems from the fact that WCAG success criteria need to be testable. They don't allow for nuance. Oops, jumped over a slide. WCAG SCs are binary in their definition. You either pass or you fail a particular SC. There's no middle ground. And sometimes the values or the restrictions of a particular success criterion can be almost arbitrary to reach that particular binary pass-fail state. If you think about color contrast minimums, I have a screenshot here of the color contrast analyzer showing that if you have a foreground color of 77777 on white, that fails because based on the WCAG color contrast calculations, that comes in at just under 4.5 to 1. So for small text, that would fail. But as soon as you go with a hex value of 767677 on white, that exactly hits 4.5 to 1. And for small text, it passes. Now, visually, you can't see an actual difference between those two grey values that we have here. However, one passes and one fails because WCAG had to make a very clear binary pass or fail state for these things. And no weighting is given to the impact or the frequency of a particular fail if you follow WCAG, or how bad a failure is off the mark. We saw the example just now of the contrast. If my contrast is just below 4.5 to 1, that's almost a cavalier, yeah, you just about missed it. But there are certainly situations where you might miss the color contrast requirements by a mile. But both are effectively fails of the same strength. And sometimes when you're doing an audit, you really want to say, yes, this fails normatively, but it's not as bad. But really you can't. There's no way of expressing that when doing an accessibility audit. Now, if you fail a single success criterion, you can't really claim that a site or content is conformant, which is a problem. And because of that, and because it's so important for some site owners, for instance, or product owners, to make sure that they pass WCAG, some of these loopholes, omissions, subjective requirements that we've seen will be exploited. Now, it's not just auditors that will find these loopholes and exploit them so that, aha, gotcha, I can fail you. But authors themselves might find these loopholes and think, okay, I'm going to craft my content so that it normatively passes. It might be rubbish, but you can't claim that it fails WCAG. And we've seen some examples of this already in this presentation. Because after all, some, not all, but some clients and some site owners are really just interested in rubber stamping their accessibility effort. And here I have a very pixelated, enlarged screenshot of the old Bobby approved 3.2 button that sites used to like to put on their homepage to show just how good they are with their accessibility. So I've talked at length about problems and inconsistencies and everything else. What do we do about this? Now, I would suggest one of the best things you can do if you're interested in accessibility and WCAG specifically is to join the open debate and discussion around WCAG and the guidelines. It used to be quite secret back room on a secret private mailing list. It's now a lot more open. You can discuss things directly on GitHub, on the W3C WCAG repository. And it's also a really good place to look if there's pending clarifications. If you come across situations where you're not sure if a success criterion applies or not, or what the exact wording actually means, there's a strong chance that there might be an open issue or an open pull request about this. Now, a word of warning, the WCAG repository is very busy. There are, at this point in time, 533 open issues, 145 pull requests, 193 branches. There is certainly a backlog of work happening there within the WCAG working group. A lot of catching up to do. There's also a bit of frustration, even from myself, that currently, and understandably, most effort at the moment is going towards new WCAG 2.2 success criteria, rather than trying to fix what's broken or incorrect or only partially explained in WCAG 2.0 and 2.1. Further work happening around accessibility guidelines is the ACT Rules community group, trying to define very specifically cases, techniques, and tests effectively on how to apply WCAG success criteria to real-world markup and content. So again, it's a community group at the W3C. They work in the open. They have a GitHub repository and a site where you can effectively look at rules that were generated by the community of practice about how to test certain success criteria against certain pieces of content. The idea originally was to create rules that can be run by automated systems. There are, however, also rules in this repository aimed at making subjective judgments from human auditors slightly less subjective, providing more context, etc. So this will be a good resource to have a look at. Another recent resource I've come across by CanAccess, an Australian accessibility company, along similar lines, trying to provide WCAG tests that are very atomic and simple to follow, so that when you're making an evaluation, you know exactly what to look for and how to decide in those particular situations, does this pass or fail? It's less dense and less technical than the ACT rules that we've just seen, but it's still early days. There's only a handful of these tests in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines checklist that CanAccess has provided. And also, there is a slight danger again. I've seen it already with the ACT rules itself, of trying to boil the ocean. Again, because real-world content, real-world web content is so varied. There are so many different situations that you might encounter in the wild. I often wonder if it's even possible to think we will have a complete set of tests, rules, checklist items that will cover every single possible scenario. But certainly for the most common ones, these sorts of approaches can help you at least shortcut decisions and be a little bit more consistent, say across your team or organization when evaluating things. And of course, we're all waiting with bated breath for WCAG 3.0. WCAG 3 is going to be a complete reworking of how accessibility guidelines are kind of written and applied. Currently, WCAG 2.2 is still very much a kind of evolutionary step of what we've seen in WCAG 2.0 and 2.1. 3.0 will be a revolutionary step, completely different. But it's still very early days, and it will be still quite a long time away before legislation, for instance, will reference WCAG 3.0. Only once it's ratified as an actual recommendation, and even then it might take quite a long time. But what WCAG 3.0 is trying to do, one of the more interesting aspects of it, is to move away from the completely binary model of pass-fail and to allow auditors to have a little bit more nuance when assessing things. We will see. But in the meantime, wrapping up finally, my advice to anybody involved with, auditing content, writing kind of assessments, is pretty please don't creatively reinterpret what a success criterion says to fit your agenda, whether you're a developer or an auditor doing an evaluation. We always come across things that we think that is just not right. I want to fail this. I just need to find some way of looking at a particular success criterion that gives me leeway to say this fails. And likewise, developers looking at success criteria, trying to find those loopholes to just squirm past something that isn't really all that good. And they know it, but they try to justify it by saying it normatively passes because of this particular nuance in the normative wording of that SC. Now, especially with auditors, I often hear, yeah, but unless I report this particular thing as a WCAG failure, the client won't change it, which is a fair point. But I would suggest that at that point, you have a more fundamental problem with a client that is not interested in accessibility per se, but just passing or failing guidelines. Because as an auditor, I would say that you do your client a disservice by not making it clear what is and isn't an actual normative WCAG failure. Certainly I come across in my assessments, I come across things that are horrendous, but I have to pass them under WCAG. It doesn't stop me from still noting somewhere in a report or whatever that you might be passing WCAG normatively, the letter of the success criteria. However, this is really rubbish and we strongly suggest that you change it. But just making up a WCAG failure and saying, well, this actually fails this, might give you a short-term solution of getting a client to look at it and address it. But what happens when a clued up client rightly challenges that claim? I've seen situations before where an auditor would say this fails, and the client would actually come back after they receive the report saying, I think you find that no, it doesn't fail for these reasons. And they were all absolutely correct on the client side. What do you do then? Do you backpedal? You could, but my fear is that at that point, all your other results in an assessment, for instance, all your other results will lose their credibility because all of a sudden the client will immediately think, well, have they actually followed the letter of WCAG, or are they just failing things willy-nilly? Be conservative in how you pass or fail certain things in your assessments. And again, I mentioned it before, document your hesitation, if at all, but clearly state when something is more of a suggestion than an actual failure. And don't make out that something is a failure when it isn't. Now, I've rambled on probably far longer than my allotted time, but if you still want more further reading, I've compiled, as part of my presentation, a whole list of interesting, if you're so inclined, issues, pull requests, resources, and you can join my WCAG Trash Panda web ring. And with that, slightly over time, I would like to say thank you very much for bearing with me all through this length of time. You'll find me on Twitter, GitHub, links to my employer, tetralogical.com, my personal site here as well. And yeah, if you hunt me down or find me, I'm more than happy to discuss your specific questions, or even just general state of the world, state of the web accessibility. So with that, thank you very much. Have a good one.